Good afternoon and welcome to the Lunchroom on Radio Caribbean International for Thursday, April the 18th, 2024. This is program number 1167 of the Lunchroom. I'm your host, Calix George Jr. And if you want to call in to tell us what's on your plate today, the number to do so is 452-3046. That's our mainline number here. Again, 452-3046. And you can also message into WhatsApp. That is 724-0008. That's the WhatsApp number. Save it on your contact list. And again, if you want to call in or message in on WhatsApp, it is 724-0008. Now, of course, in addition to radio, 101.1 FM, you can get us at our website, rcisenusha.com, and we're also streaming live on Facebook. Just search for the official page of Radio Caribbean International, and please be sure to like and share that as well with your friends and family. And if you are celebrating your birthday today, happy birthday to you. But we got some special people we want to recognize today. First, some birthday greetings going out to our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Sharon Belmar George. Happy birthday to you. And wish you an absolutely fantastic birthday celebration. Also, birthday greetings going out to Dr. Hayden Alcindor. Happy birthday to you, sir. And we're hoping that you're having a fantastic birthday as well. We also want to send birthday greetings to an individual who I believe was actually one of, if not our first, one of our very early guests here at the Lunchroom, Mr. Richard Peterkin. I hope you're enjoying your birthday, sir, and we do wish you a very, very wonderful day. And also, it is Sandy Servile's birthday. Happy birthday to you, Sandy. Wishing you a wonderful celebration. Hope you're enjoying it to the fullest. And also some greetings going out to Miss Solange Sayers. Happy birthday to you. And we're hoping that you're having a fantastic birthday. Well, a look at history for today. In the year 1506, the cornerstone of the current St. Peter's Basilica was laid in the Vatican by Pope Julius II. In the year 1783, during the American Revolution, George Washington issued general orders announcing the end of hostilities with Britain, giving thanks to the Almighty and offering congratulations, and authorizing an extra ration of alcohol to the troops to celebrate. In the year 1906, on this day, San Francisco saw an earthquake, which also resulted in a fire and killed nearly 4,000 people, while destroying nearly 3/4 of that city over in California. 1906 on this day saw the beatification of Joan of Arc, and that happened at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. 1924, 100 years ago, for those of you who are great fans of crossword puzzles, well, the first crossword puzzle book was published, and that was by the publishers Simon and Schuster. And in 1954 on this day, the Egyptian Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser seized power and appointed himself as Prime Minister of Egypt. And in 1955 on this day, Nobel Prize winner for physics and of course a gentleman known by all around the world, Albert Einstein, he died on this day. And we now move on to our dish of the day. The daily dish is brought with the kind compliments of our good friends at Tiles Plus.
One tiles for your home, I see. Bathroom, kitchen, pantry. Need tiles for your balcony. Come down to Tiles Plus, satisfaction guarantee. Tiles Plus, Tiles Plus, Tiles Plus. Big tiles with unbeatable cost. Customer service, A+. Did all kind of tiles. Come down to Tiles Plus. We also got gasware and vanity. Books, doors, you'll see. Come down to mind nobody. We got the best tiles on island. Trust me. We are located Lance Road in Castries, Bosses Joux Grizzly, and Flag Street in Viewfort. Telephone number 453-7939. Tiles Plus.
Serving now, the Daily Dish.
And welcome back to our program for today. And we do hope that we're having a good one. And we will at some point later on hopefully try to take in that clip which I mentioned to you about effectively the history of an item which we perhaps don't think about very often. Maybe you think of it from the context of people who are working in construction. And it's a very, very interesting video off YouTube, which speaks to what we can learn from the history of the wheelbarrow. But we'll come to that in a little bit, because it actually does, there's a lesson within the whole history of it, which this author was making the point of looking at. And I think it's within that context that I definitely would like to share that with you. In the news here in St. Lucia, one matter which has been out there for a little while now, and it became popularized by none other than the leader of the opposition, the Honorable Alan Chasney, in relation to this entire matter regarding Dr. Ernest Hilaire. And it would appear that he certainly had great issue with the time of Mr. Hilaire and his departure from his position as High Commissioner over in the United Kingdom. And there was this entire issue over a vehicle owned by Mr. Hilaire coming back to St. Lucia. And you may know that High Commissioners, returning nationals, in fact, overall receive duty-free concessions. They can bring in, vehicles and other possessions that they have without paying any applicable taxes on it. But there was a big splash about it by then Prime Minister Mr. Alan Chasney. It was christened Rover Gate in reference to the type of vehicle that was apparently the subject of this extensive investigation during the time of Mr. Chasney. And quite a lot. We saw even the extent of the that vehicle, I think, being seized by customs officials going to the home of Dr. Hilaire, and a whole hurrah about the matter, which seems so very distant at this point in time in our minds. But certainly it appeared that, of course, there was this great attempt at looking into this entire matter. Well, one decision coming out of it and related to it is with respect to Mr. Alan Chasney and his appeal against the customs controller. And that story coming from St. Lucia Times, of course, a judgment coming out of the Court of Appeal just yesterday on this entire matter. So let's just quickly read that statement. That's a story. Opposition leader Alan Chasney's bid to appeal a High Court decision at the Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal has failed. According to court documents, quote, this is an appeal against the High Court judge's decision dismissing the appellant Alan Chasney's application for leave to commence judicial review proceedings against the decision of the respondents, Sherman Emanuel, Comptroller of Customs, and Paul Noel, a Customs Inspector, to discontinue or withdraw criminal proceedings against Dr. Ernest Hilaire. And just to back up a little bit, you'd recall that proceedings had commenced, and so in fact, effectively what Mr. Chasney was doing was taking that decision to withdraw the criminal proceedings to a judicial review. And he wasn't successful at making that application for leave, which is required of the court. So the court has to agree to the action of a judicial review. And at the level of the High Court judge, that was dismissed. And then he appealed the matter to the Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal, and this is in fact what is most recently also lost by Mr. Chasney. So just to continue with that story, last year the High Court ruled in favor of the comptroller, affirming his authority to drop charges against Hilaire. The Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal found that the comptroller had the implied power to discontinue proceedings against Hilaire and affirmed that the Director of Public Prosecutions had not taken over the case. It further ruled that allegations of political interference were speculation. However, the Court of Appeal sided with Chasney in one matter, striking down a costs order against him imposed by the High Court. Chasney spoke with Loop News and stated an intention to pursue an appeal to the Caribbean Court of Justice. The court documents provided the following background. The relevant background to this appeal begins in or around November 2017, when the Director of Finance sent a memorandum to the then Comptroller of Customs, Mr. Chico, in 2017, raising concerns about a missing government vehicle and further requesting that an investigation be conducted into the importation of a Land Rover, the vehicle, by Dr. Hilaire on 18th December 2015. What followed was a 3-year-long investigation by the Customs and Excise Department, leading to Mr. Chico making a request for Dr. Hilaire under Section 102.2 of the Customs Control and Management Act to produce information, more specifically a copy of the commercial invoice from the supplier of the vehicle. Empowered by Section 119 of the Act, the respondents instituted criminal proceedings in the name of the second respondent against Dr. Hilaire in or around October 2020 for his alleged failure without reasonable cause to produce the requested documents and information. The said charges having been put before a magistrate, a mediation process ensued in which Dr. Hilaire was represented by Mr. Leslie Mondesi, then private legal practitioner, who subsequently was appointed as Attorney General of St. Lucia. Subsequent to the charges being brought against Dr. Hilaire, the respondents were on several occasions represented at hearings before the magistrate by legal counsel from the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. However, the first respondent, that is Comptroller Emmanuel, made the decision to discontinue or withdraw those proceedings, having reached the conclusion that they could not be legally or factually sustained. On the 2nd of December 2021, the magistrate, in his formal order, noted the discontinuance of the said charges against Dr. Hilaire and made certain consequential orders which resulted in the return of the vehicle to Dr. Hilaire. The appellant, the former Prime Minister of St. Lucia and current leader of the opposition, being dissatisfied with the decision to discontinue the criminal proceedings against Dr. Hilaire, sought leave of the High Court of Justice to commence judicial review of the decision pursuant to Rule 56.3 of the Civil Procedure Rules of 2000. The main issues raised on the leave application were whether Section 119 of the Act authorized the respondents to discontinue criminal proceedings, whether the Director of Public Prosecutions, or the DPP, took over the prosecution of Dr. Hilaire, and whether the power to discontinue those proceedings was vested in him under Section 73(2)(c) of the Constitution, and whether Comptroller Emmanuel consulted and obtained legal advice from the Attorney General prior to discontinuing the charges, which was the point of political interference. The High Court judge determined that the appellant did not meet the threshold for the grant of leave, as he did not advance any arguable ground for judicial review which had a realistic prospect of success. The judge found that Section 119 of the Act conferred prosecutorial powers on the comptroller, and the proviso to Section 73(4) of the Constitution empowered the comptroller to discontinue or withdraw prosecutions with the leave of the court. In any event, the judge found that there was no evidence that the DPP took over and continued the prosecution. The judge also found that the facts presented by the appellant did not support the argument that the decision to discontinue or withdraw the prosecution was a subject of political influence. The appellant, Mr. Shastney, advanced 9 grounds of appeal to this court. Ground 1 concerned whether the judge erred in concluding that the appellant failed to meet the threshold for the grant of leave to commence judicial review proceedings. Grounds 2 to 6 concerned whether the DPP took over the prosecution of the case, an issue which was central to the determination of the appeal. Grounds 7 and 8 concerned the allegations of political interference. Finally, ground 9 concerned whether the judge erred in making a costs award in favor of the respondents. Regarding grounds 1 through 8, the Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal ruled against Shastney, affirming the judge did not err in concluding that the appellant failed to meet the threshold for the grant of leave to commence judicial review proceedings, that the DPP did not take over the prosecution of the case, and that allegations of political interference amounted to mere speculation. Regarding ground 9, the general rule is that no order for costs may be made against an applicant for an administrative order unless the court considers that the applicant has acted unreasonably in making the application or in the conduct of the application. On this basis, the court agrees with the appellant and the respondents do not demur that the High Court judge erred in making a costs order against the appellant, that the said costs order ought to be set aside, and an order of no costs as to costs substituted. Similarly, as it relates to costs in the appeal, the court finds that there is no good reason to deviate from the general rule. And that synopsis of that matter, thanks to the good people over at Loop St. Lucia who took forward this story. That's our dish of the day. When we come back, we're going to be taking in your calls, and perhaps later on in the program, as I mentioned, I'll try to play that video clip.
This has been The Daily Dish.
One tiles for your home, I see. Bathroom, kitchen, pantry. Need tiles for your balcony. Come down to Tiles Plus, satisfaction guarantee. Tiles Plus, Tiles Plus, Tiles Plus. Big tiles with unbeatable cost. Customer service, A+. With all kind of tiles, come down to Tiles Plus. We also got gasway and vanity. Books, doors, you'll see. Come down to mind nobody. We got the best tiles on island. Trust me. We are located Land Street in Castries, Bosses Grozile, and Slack Street in Beaufort. Telephone number 453-7939. Tiles Plus.
And welcome back to the lunchroom here at Radio Caribbean International. And of course, the number to call in to tell us what's on your plate today, it is 452-3046. Again, 452-3046, as well as our WhatsApp number, that is 724-0008. If you'd like to call in or message into that number, you have that option. And of course, a very good afternoon to all those who are following with us on our Facebook Live as well. We do hope that you're having a pretty good one. So as to whether we've seen the last of this matter, we will have to still wait. And it will be a matter that appears, according to Mr. Shastney, will be brought forward to the Caribbean Court of Justice, which now serves as the final appellate court for St. Lucia. And we'll have to wait and see what the outcome of that matter may be in his application to the court to appeal this matter from the Court of Appeal. And we'll have to see what comes of that. But of course, even that matter itself, I mean, we've seen even prior to the actions of then Comptroller Chico, we'd seen a number of different comptrollers come and go, and of course, it would appear that this matter seemed not to have going forward under those controllers. It eventually did get to the point where Comptroller Chico took the action that he did, which of course led to that issue of the seizure of a vehicle, which, based on what we were reading there, was somehow being claimed by the government of St. Lucia as their property, very strangely enough, perhaps, within that context, because one could similarly ask, well, did the government of St. Lucia at any time provide funds for the purchase of this vehicle, or was it supposed to have been at any time because of some sort of contractual arrangement or agreement to have been provided to the government of St. Lucia? A very, very interesting claim that a person could have purchased a vehicle, and as an individual who was serving in the foreign service, and that person is returning, and then to claim that vehicle was then somehow the property of the government of St. Lucia. And I think that is really one of the issues with respect to this entire matter, given that long history of the back and forth of it. But, we've seen these things, and we've, of course, always appreciated how they have been somehow cast in some sort of catchy new name. And we've heard of Rover Gate, and of course, that has become a very popular word for some. I guess in an earlier era, perhaps it would have been Grindberg, or Rochamel, something to that effect. But this one, apparently still being kept alive by the leader of the opposition in this matter. Of course, you'll have to see whether the Caribbean Court of Justice also agrees with him in that upcoming matter. Now, we're actually due to take in our weather report at this time, so I think we're going to go across, and thanks to the St. Lucia Met Office, take in that weather report for 12 noon.
Island style, yeah. We got the time to make you go. We got the time to make you say, yeah. We'll have to make the right choice. Island style, whoa. We got the time that will make you happy. Island style, oh yeah. We make your dream come alive in Island style. We have tiles and thin sets, pieces and ground. Everything you need, we sort the house out. For the best price and the latest style, take a little drive down to Island Style Car. We got the time to make you go. We got the time to make you say, quality, price, service, choice. It's all an Island Style.
Visit us at our showrooms in Belarus, Rodney Bay, on the John Compton Highway, Cass Street, and behind Ruby's Gas Station on the Library Viewfort Highway. Or call us on 450-452 or 453-TILE. Island Style Tile and Bath. When you think tile, think Island Style.
This is Radio Caribbean International. It's now time for the weather news.
And of course, to the 1.1, it's now time for your weather report as of 12 noon today, presented by Island Style Talemba. The forecast for St. Lucia Valley for the next 24 hours. The winds will be blowing from between the east and east-southeast, near 15 miles per hour. The weather fair to occasionally cloudy and hazy with a few showers. And there is an advisory in here, it says, which reads, persons with respiratory ailments and dust allergies are advised to take the necessary precautions. Also, small craft operators are advised to exercise caution due to reduced visibility. The forecast for Los Angeles, partly cloudy to occasionally cloudy and hazy with widely scattered showers over the Leeward and Northern Windward Islands. Elsewhere, fair to partly cloudy and hazy with isolated showers. The weather summary: a surface to low-level trough will continue to generate cloudiness and scattered showers over the northern half of the Lesser Antilles during the forecast period. A plume of Saharan dust haze will cause a reduction in visibility and air quality across the Eastern Caribbean region over the next few days. And this was your weather report as of 12 noon today, presented by Island Style Talent Bath.
This has been RCI's Weather News. For more information, call the Weather Hotline at 454-3452. RCI 101 number 1.
We got the time to make you go. We got the time to make you say, we'll have to make the right choice. Island style. Whoa. We got the time that will make you happy. Island style. Oh yeah. We make your dream come alive in Island style. We have tiles and insets, mixes and ground. Everything you need to sort the house out. For the best price and the latest style. Take a little drive down to Island Style Car. We got the time to make you go. We got the time to make you say, quality, price, service, choice. It's all at Island Style.
Visit us at our showrooms in Belarus, Rodney Bay, on the John Compton Highway, Cass Street, and behind Ruby's Gas Station on the Library Viewfort Highway. Or call us on 450-452 or 453-TILE. Island Style Tile and Bath. When you think tile, think Island Style.
And welcome back to our program here at the Lunchroom on Radio Caribbean International. And of course, as I mentioned, if you want to call and tell us what's on your plate today, the number to do so is 452-3046, as well as our WhatsApp number. It is 724-0008. Again, 724-0008. Now, I've been meaning to play this clip for a little while, and I'm going to try to take an opportunity to do so now. It's a little lengthy, but if we start it now, we should be able to get through it. And it's on a very bizarre topic, one might say, because it's actually not something that we would normally think about. But I thought it was pretty interesting in some regards, and it's by a historian who actually puts out quite a number of these pieces, and it kind of chronicles how sometimes we look at history and we may want to interpret things a particular way, and sometimes we've got to be very careful to jump to conclusions, because we quite often are applying a particular way of thinking that we have in today's reality, and somehow trying to project it on the people who may have been living before us, and hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years before our time, and so it's sometimes difficult to be able to understand what were the motivations of why people did what they did, and this is actually a sort of a journey by this individual, and how this one particular item, which we would think is pretty ubiquitous at this time, that of the wheelbarrow, and why looking at this, in fact, is pretty interesting within the context, the greater context of our history and our story, and moving into this current period. So hopefully we can just take a quick listen to it, and maybe at some points we can get some conversation on it too as well.
Been thinking a lot about wheelbarrows lately, and it's because of comments I got on a previous video where people talked about wheelbarrows, and it's not something I usually think about, but so that video was about Africa, And I said in the video that people in Central and West Africa did not have the wheel prior to modern times because the tsetse fly would kill any draft animals that they would have brought in to pull their carts around. And, so no draft animals to pull carts, therefore no wheels. And then some of the people in the comments were like, well, what about wheelbarrows? Couldn't people in Africa have used wheelbarrows? And I think that's a really interesting question, actually, and it's one that's worth exploring. But I thought also that it was interesting that they were asking it, because some of the people asking about wheelbarrows were just like, it was just idle curiosity, and it was just something that popped up in their head, and they were wondering, well, what about wheelbarrows? But some of them kind of doubled down on it, and they were like, wheelbarrows make so much more sense than carrying stuff around. Carrying stuff around on your head never makes sense when you have a wheelbarrow. And so if anyone is doing work carrying things around, they're obviously going to want to use a wheelbarrow, and if they don't have a wheelbarrow, they'll invent one. So what's the deal with these Africans? They weren't inventing wheelbarrows. And I find that an interesting assumption that people would make. And I'm not prepared to answer the question why Africans did not have wheelbarrows, for reasons that I think will become apparent as we go along in the video. But I do want to talk about wheelbarrows, because I find this a convenient entry point for thinking about the history of technology in general. I want to use thinking about wheelbarrows as a way of understanding the history of technology. First of all, let's consider where wheelbarrows existed. In antiquity, wheelbarrows were only used in one place, and that was China. Our earliest evidence for wheelbarrows in China dates to the Han Dynasty, which is about 2,000 years ago. It was not used anywhere else. The Indians, no one in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, nobody used wheelbarrows. And also ancient Rome. No one in ancient Rome used wheelbarrows. In Europe, wheelbarrows start to appear in our textual record around the year 1200. Roughly. We're not sure exactly, because it's sometimes hard to interpret the evidence, actually. But sometime during the Central Middle Ages, it pops up in Europe. And so that, I think, when we're thinking about why weren't they using wheelbarrows in Africa, one thing that I think about is, well, gosh, it's just really hard to tell why people use wheelbarrows, like when they do and when they don't. Like, why is it that Chinese were using wheelbarrows and not Mesopotamians? Like, I don't even know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer to the question why the ancient Romans didn't use wheelbarrows. And there could be all sorts of reasons why ancient Romans did not adopt the wheelbarrow. And I'm not going to sit here and speculate about all those reasons. I'm just going to say, like, they didn't use them. So obviously there's a scenario where people who are perfectly smart and capable and are obviously constructing things and have a demand for manual labor and are doing all the things that you would think a wheelbarrow would be suited for, and still they didn't use wheelbarrow. So this brings us to the first lesson that wheelbarrows teach us about the history of technology, which is that technologies are only obvious in hindsight. It might be obvious to us to use a wheelbarrow in a given situation, but that doesn't mean that it would be obvious to someone who had never thought of a wheelbarrow before. Even in a situation where all the ingredients for a wheelbarrow exists. If you consider, like in medieval Europe, they had wheels and axles, and they had hand barrows, which is kind of like a wheelbarrow, but the handles are on both ends. So it looks like a stretcher, and two workmen carry the load around with the thing between them. And a wheelbarrow is simply taking a hand barrow and removing the handles on one end and attaching a wheel and axle. And now you have a wheelbarrow. So at any time during the early Middle Ages, somebody in Europe could have thought up, oh, why don't I just attach a wheel to one end of this hand barrow? And no one did. Not until, at the minimum, the 12th century. Now, I want to qualify what I just said, because in modern times, I think it's a little bit different. In our modern culture, We think about technology all the time. We think about what's the new model of iPhone coming out, or the new car model, and what features does the new car have, and cars have features now that they didn't have 10 years ago. And we think about like tech news, and there's AI in the news all the time. And our biggest, most prestigious corporations are tech companies, and there's tech all the time. And we're always thinking about new technological things coming out. And so for us, it might be that we would, and I think arguably this is the case, that we anticipate new technologies before they come along, because we can see where the trend lines are going. But that's not true of the Middle Ages or of antiquity, because people in those eras did not see technology developing rapidly before their eyes. The way the world was in their childhood was pretty much, from a technological standpoint, pretty much identical to the way it was when they were in old age. And new technologies would come along from time to time. So certainly there were generations of farmers where they would become aware of some new farming technique or some new farming tool that would become available. But it wasn't such that they expected new innovations happening all the time. So with that being the case, there was a mindset that the world is a static state world from the standpoint of technology. That the lifestyle, the quality of life, the standard of living of a farmer, as far as they were concerned, was the way of life of farmers going back all the way to the very beginning, and would be the way of life of people all the way to the end of time. And given that expectation about the world, it would not occur to them to think about what new innovations they might come up with, what new technologies they might try to invent. Now, there were people in the Middle Ages that did think about technologies and did take an interest in those sorts of things, but they were the rare exception. All right, so that's the first point. Second point is, I mentioned that China had the wheelbarrow first. Wheelbarrow was in China for 1,000 years, then it popped up in Europe. Now, when it popped up in Europe, was that because the idea for the wheelbarrow had been introduced from China, or was it invented independently in Europe? Either of those is possible. There was contact between Europe and Asia, so they could have gotten the idea that way. On the other hand, cities were expanding in the 12th and 13th centuries in Europe, especially the 13th century. And there was, construction happening and stuff. So it could have been a spontaneous local thing. We also don't know if it was invented once in Europe or several times. There are different styles of wheelbarrow popping up more or less around the same time in the 13th century. Does that mean there were multiple different inventions by different people? We just don't know. And this gets us to our second point, which is that it's really hard to trace the origins of a technology. At least in the Middle Ages and in antiquity. Now, modern times is easier because people have to file patents, and there's just, in general, lots and lots of writing happening. But in the Middle Ages, craftsmen did not write things down, typically. There were people who could read and write, but they were only in certain professions. It was if you worked in the church, if you studied theology, or if you worked in medicine or in the law, then you would know how to read and also write, but mainly to read, because you had to be able to read ancient texts. Those professions were based on reading ancient texts, and so reading was necessary. It was not necessary in order to pursue a career as a farmer or as a leather tanner, a carpenter, a stonemason, any of those things, a cartwright, any of those professions. You did not need to be able to read to do those professions, and typically people who did those professions were illiterate. It's not like today where everyone reads all the time and everyone's forced to learn how to read whether they want to or not, and we're surrounded by the necessity of reading because we've got the internet and we have to fill out government forms all the time. I make it sound like government forms are but you know what I mean. But government forms were not really a thing. I mean, they did exist, but in a much, much smaller scale, and most people didn't have to fill them out. No one was going to the DMV in the Middle Ages. So literacy was not a thing, was not kind of this like obligatory thing like it is now. And therefore, when you're pursuing your craft as a carpenter or a cartwright, it would not occur to you to write down, hey, I made a wheelbarrow for the first time ever, or, whatever. I heard about this wheelbarrow, this fancy new idea from this traveler from China. Like, people didn't write that kind of thing down. And so we never know when an invention was invented. If you read about the history of technology in the Middle Ages, if you try to find out what's the origin of this particular technology, it will always say, I don't know always, maybe I shouldn't say that categorically, but typically it'll say, we don't know the origins exactly, we don't know precisely when this invention appeared. It first occurs in the written record in this year, but that could mean anything. It could mean that people had been using it for 50 years before some priest decided to write down about it and in passing, or some artist decided to depict it in an illustration. But there were no patents, and no one was writing down specifically, here's what the craftsmen are doing. That was not usually a thing that literate people took an interest in writing about. They wrote about political events, they wrote about churchy type stuff, religious stuff. I'm speaking, of course, in particular about Europe. But they didn't write about what the Cartwrights were doing. All right, so for the third point, I want to show you some pictures. Here are some pictures of workers in the late Middle Ages building stuff. And you'll notice that they're carrying loads on their backs or they're using hand barrows, but they're not using wheelbarrows, even though this was a time period in which wheelbarrows existed in Europe. Now here are some depictions of women in more recent times, during the 18th and 19th centuries, carrying loads on their heads. Now these are European women, and they're all holding baskets on their heads. I don't know if holding is the right word in this context, but they've got baskets on their heads with various things in the baskets, like food, laundry, a baby, all sorts of things in these baskets, and they're carrying them on their heads. Now we in North America think of head porterage, which is what this is called, or head carrying, as something that's done in faraway exotic lands, like, indigenous women in South America, or women in Africa, or women in India. They carry stuff around on their heads. We don't usually think of white women carrying stuff around on their heads. Nevertheless, that was what white women used to do up until the 19th century, and in some parts of Europe until the 20th century. So this is not just something that's an exotic thing that strange brown people do. This is something that it's universal. Women all over the world used to do this. It stopped in recent times in the West because of modern technology, but it was a perfectly normal thing back then. And again, I want to point out, these women were carrying loads on their heads when wheelbarrows existed in Europe. So it's not an obvious thing to say, well, women in Africa were carrying stuff around on their heads because wheelbarrows weren't there. If they had had wheelbarrows, they would have put their loads in the wheelbarrows and moved them around. It's not as simple as that, because we have evidence. It's not even evidence, it's proof. We've got so much proof that women in Europe were doing the same thing when they had wheelbarrows around. So it's not as simple as saying a wheelbarrow is always a labor-saving device. It's always an improvement over carrying stuff around with your body. It's always a better option. We can't say that categorically. So here's the third lesson. Technologies have context. We could say in a sort of ethereal, abstract way that one technology is better than another technology or more advanced than another technology. But those judgments don't mean anything in practicality, because whether a technology is better or worse has to do with whether it's more useful or not. And what makes a technology useful has a lot of variables involved. There are economic factors that in play. There are cultural factors, social factors that all play into whether one technology or another is more useful, or one technique for solving a problem, one approach to solving a problem is more advantageous or less advantageous than another one. So it's not enough to simply look at a case scenario where they're not using a wheel or they're not using a wheelbarrow and say that's definitely a less optimal situation. But this could, of course, raise an interesting question. Why were European women carrying stuff on their heads when they could have been using wheelbarrows? What was going on? But in order to answer that question, we would have to have a lot of background information about the context. What was the actual labor that women did? What was their daily routine? And would a wheelbarrow have fit into that? Was it a scenario where women are just constantly going in and out of doors? They're picking up and putting down loads very often. They have to have their hands free to grab stuff and they can't use a wheelbarrow. What were women doing in their day-to-day work? We have to consider that. We have to consider all of those factors before we can evaluate why a given technology wasn't implemented in that case. And so that's true if we're trying to understand European women and why they were doing head carrying. And likewise, that's also true if we're looking at Africa and we're wondering why were Africans carrying stuff on their heads? We can't just jump to a conclusion right away and say it must have been X, it must have been Y. I know the answer, blah, blah, blah. You have to do a deep dive into what is the culture of that area, what are the economic factors at play, what is the daily life of a woman or of a male, constructing a building, for example. What is their daily life, what is the actual process of their labor, and would a wheelbarrow have fit into that? You have to know all those things before you can answer the question, why were they not using a wheelbarrow? And that's why I'm not prepared to answer that question in this video. I'm not prepared to say why Africa didn't have the wheelbarrow. I can't answer that question. So I'm just going to leave it out there. I'm going to leave it on the table. I'm like, and if anybody else wants to explore that and try to figure that out, that's fine with me. I can't do it. So let me know what you think. And thanks for watching.
Right. Thanks for that. And as I mentioned, it was a little long, but I hope you did enjoy it. That thought journey and investigation being provided by this historian, looking at the issue of technology and how people decided to take on technology and how sometimes we can quite easily decide that one is better than the other, that one skill has to be put aside to adopt another. And of course, in this instance, this whole massive debate about wheelbarrows is an interesting one because within that context, you saw some level of suggestion where, why is it that these people couldn't create a certain technology within that context? It has so much more to it than what we sometimes even appreciate in terms of the factors of environment, the factors of climate, what's available and what's not. A lot of that has to come to play in how things actually end up evolving and changing over time. But of course, a lot of the biases as well in understanding, who did what and what was going on was also very, very telling too, in that he actually made that very interesting point that not too long ago, women in Europe actually also carrying things on their heads. I mean, we here have this image of people who were carrying coal on their heads, heading up these gangways to deposit the coal into these ships. All right, that was a sort of big industry for a lot of women during that period of time, and it tended to be the women who had this skill to be able to balance things on their heads in that way, similar as we're seeing in other areas. And so it is certainly a very interesting issue that we should consider, and how we actually see things has a lot to do with the amount of information that's available and not jumping to conclusions about lots of stuff that we are, in fact, want to be able to understand. It's quite often the story is not just one-on-one, and that gives the full picture of what's going on. So it definitely shines some light on a lot of this matter, I would like to believe. And of course, the issue of technology and how quickly it's actually changing. We are living in a world right now where we're seeing immensely rapid changes in technology that is leading to tremendous amount of quote-unquote growth and change. But at the same time, we have to be mindful that there are other technologies and other skills that sometimes get thrown out and may very well still have some use somewhere down the road. And we've seen that story. We've seen that story in so many areas. If you think of mathematics, for instance, as a technology or a base input for technology, you'll find a lot of mathematicians who studied pure mathematics and came up with lots of different models and theories and ways of thinking about stuff. And sometimes these things actually sit in some book for years and years and years and years, and they don't actually find immediate application until later on somebody says, oh, you know what, I could actually use this theorem. I actually could apply this model to what this technology, this is what to solve something many, many years later. And so the importance of collecting knowledge, collating knowledge, collating technologies is highly important. And that's something that we are seeing more and more of in today's world. It is a fact, it's a risk, in fact, that we are finding ourselves with in areas like agriculture, for instance, and where you have hybridization being used, and we're seeing genetic modification, and so you're getting one particular variety of a fruit or vegetable getting to a point where it almost becomes a monocrop. It's the only one or primary one being used in that particular fruit or vegetable, and it becomes a significant risk to disease. And we've seen that with bananas, for instance. As before, there would have been a lot more varieties of bananas, and thanks to hybridization, we're seeing a lot of those that were used in the past were not being used today. And so you've got these Cavendish varieties, and which are effectively clones, have billions and billions and billions of clones effectively. And so when a disease comes about, it can be pretty devastating. So being able to conserve, even from that perspective, is a really important matter too, because it is sometimes from these other varieties that we can then begin to gain some sort of protection or to be able to prevent the spread of other diseases. So definitely, it's sometimes there's that desire to throw things away, throw away technologies that maybe may think are defunct or don't have to be used anymore. But sometimes as well, there is benefit in conserving some of these technologies to ensure that they can still be potentially used later on. One feel that you're seeing it happening, interesting enough, even though you've got immense amounts of new technology coming up and being used, is in the area of aerospace, and in particular systems that NASA runs, for an example. you find that NASA has sent out things into the world to explore into the space, and these are still sending information back, sometimes decades, 40 years on, and they're still actually utilizing information which was based on technology that is 40 years old, and so of course you still have to support that system in place. So thinking about it, of course, especially as we are continuing this really rapid change in technology around the world, there is sometimes benefit in actually ensuring that you've got other technologies, if at least, for the very least, to have that backup, to be able to know that you've got some redundancy, to have some other form of actually transmitting or doing something. And that's really important as well, especially in a world right now where we live, for instance, in a space that's becoming more driven by videos and pictures. In some respects, we're going back in time to how it was done by the Egyptians and the hieroglyphs and the pictograms that they used. We're seeing that in some form becoming even I would say more prevalent than actual writing. Of course, we still have writing systems that are very important, but you're finding, especially among young people, the gravity is to move towards video and audio-visual experiences. But the importance of writing within this context still very, very important. But that's our program for today, and we'll be back again tomorrow for another one. God willing, hope you can join us for that. I'm your host, Calix George Jr., saying goodbye.